So I'm going to read you my favorite things I wrote in 2022. I had a really great writing year this year. I wrote a lot. I'm going to share a couple of things from a couple of different projects. Make sure you guys check out the trigger warnings in the comments below, just in case any of the material in these excerpts are sensitive to you. So the first project I'm going to read from is The Sun Only Drowns Us, which off the top of my head, how I can describe this project is a 14-year-old girl named Eva ends up living off the grid with her neighbor Lillian and Lillian's weird little family because Lillian believes that the sun is poisonous and is coming to kill everybody. So it's wild. It's really fun. I wanted to read a little chunk that I wrote because I needed to finish this first chapter for my workshop. And this is adult literary fiction. My mother was unconscious in the foyer. The front door nudged against her shoulder as I entered the house, crinkled the chemise blouse she wore every day as a way to trick herself into believing she'd put her life back together. She wasn't even aware when she'd fallen apart, and I wasn't either. But still, she wore that same dust-colored shirt every day as if it proved something about her that only she'd understand. I closed the door, then crouched in front of her. In my haste to grab the super glue, I'd run out of the Radaccia home without my shoes. I nudged my bare toe against my mother's arm. Her position wasn't concerning to me. I'd find her draped over random places all over the home, even in our old apartment. Sometimes over the counter, a box of digestive biscuits still in her hand from where she must have grabbed them from the cabinet. Sometimes over her bathroom sink, a toothbrush lodged against her gums. So that's a little bit of The Sun Only Drowns Us. Let's jump into feeding habits. Oh, feeding habits, bane of my existence, love of my life, etc., etc. This was an adult literary fiction novel that I started in April of 2020 and I finished in June of 2022. It is book 2 of a duology, which is the duology itself is a spinoff of this giant series called Fostered. Video in the cards and in the description about how that series came to be because it's quite complicated if you are new to this channel. But essentially, it's just the sequel to Mothwork. These books follow 2 characters, which I will talk about later as well, Harrison and Lonan and their tumultuous relationship. In particular, Feeding Habits follows Lonan as he struggles to survive a toxic relationship. And on the other hand, in the other point of view, because it's a dual point of view novel, we also follow Harrison, who struggles to really fit into his restart after he moves to New York City with his mother as a means to basically get over his relationship and bad breakup with Lonan. Obviously, this book ends badly for both of them. And this chapter is particularly bad for Harrison. So in 2021, I wrote a chapter, I believe, called Weeping Statue, and it was chapter 7. And it sucked. That's all I have to say. It sucked. And I had to rewrite it. So I rewrote it in the summer, and I ended up loving it because it's called Harrison Chaos Town, and we love Harrison. When he gets chaotic, it's the best. So Harrison goes to a church so that he can embody Lonan, basically. We love this atheist going to a church just so that he can get the religious vibes. So here we go. In the deep night, Harrison finds a church. Winking under street lamps, a haloed Jesus saturates a stained glass panel. He's not looking for God. Really, he couldn't care less about a floating man in the sky, a spattering of poorly written verses on paper thin enough to eat, a congregation of people blissfully tricked into optimism. What he desires most fairly is a man. Still wobbly from the wine and thinking of Reeve, he crosses the slushy road and tries to convince himself he's a concerned friend, figuring she might have disappeared in need of spiritual intervention, that he knows she fears something and that something could very well be a god. It's not true, of course. Harrison's never been a very good liar, and as he approaches the church's stairway, he pretends he isn't relieved when for a drunken half-second, he believes his shadow belongs to her brother, which is Lonan. By the time he opens the church's oakwood door, he accepts she was right to say he only wanted to see her because he so desperately misses Lonan, that she was right to hop the garden's fence and run without him back to her roommate boyfriend, that he hopes she'll one day find herself salsa dancing in a crowded room where he can't call her up just to confirm someone else somewhere has her face, that more than anything, he's drunk and so in need of Lonan. Maybe it's the Lord that makes him so self-aware. The reason I love this excerpt is because I really figured out who Harrison was. I think through writing Seventh Virtue, you get to see him being kind of self-destructive and chaotic. In Feeding Habits, Harrison is 22, and in Seventh Virtue, Harrison is 25. So, you'd think he would be doing positive development in Seventh Virtue. He's not. But anyway, because his chaotic self really came through in Seventh Virtue, I was really able to understand where he was mentally in this scene. The self-aware line, I'm just going to put that in Seventh Virtue. So this is Harrison inside of the church. Inside, the church is larger than it appeared. In the nave, Harrison stares at the same portrait of Jesus he looked at from the street. Snow flecks his holy hands, and the face of the sheep next to him clouds the red glass. On a votive candle stand, a few remaining flames flicker. Lonan would know what they mean, who they're for, what they do, so Harrison wants to know too. He crosses over to the stand, alternates between picking up the candles and blowing them out. 1, 2, 3, 4 active flames, ribbon to smoke. You're not supposed to do that, comes a voice. God? Lonan would know. Harrison turns. The church is too dark to notice his face at first, shielded near the altar, but Harrison walks toward the sound. As he passes pews, he imagines himself as alone and imagining the people who prayed there. A young bride-to-be begging for sunshine on her wedding day, a 9-year-old with a bowed head so desperate for a Cabbage Patch Kid. Those are prayers, the voice says again. If Harrison wanted to, he could believe it's Lonan's, even if his vowels are too harsh and his S's too soft. Vows. Sounds serious, Harrison says to the broad church. By now he's approached the bema, close enough to notice how moonlight strikes the hanging face of crucified Jesus, and then more subtly, the eyes of a man. If he wanted to, he could believe they're crystalline blue, like the purest tablespoons of ocean, even if they're really a dull brown. That depends on the God you believe in, says the voice, its eyes blinking. After a moment, out comes the side of a face from behind a candelabra. Light hair, a heavy jaw, all wrong to be Lonan, but Harrison could believe. Harrison ascends the first step leading to the altar, just a few feet away from the man now. It's the mix of his drunkenness and the lack of light that makes it difficult to perceive the person standing on the opposite side of the altar. I don't believe in anything, he says. And then more clearly, as the man steps toward the right side of the altar, the face. Freckled, not smooth. Tanned, not pale. Rich, coming from a man standing in a church. Then back into the shadows he goes. Harrison squints. Most everything in the church is an incomprehensible blob. That's only natural since he hardly understands most of what he looks at, but the longer he stares, the clearer the structures in front of him appear. A silver chalice engraved with a verse from Revelations, the man's ear, a napkin folded 3 times, the man's stubble, a green Bible, the man's shoulder. Harrison takes another step forward, close enough to touch the altar. Moving carefully like he's trying not to scare off a skittish dog, he inches his hand forward until it brushes the man's. He leans forward until he smells bergamot and whispers, "Come into the light, I want to see your face." Harrison! So the next bit is Lonan and Harrison. It's like the end scene, like the last scene you see them together, where they actually kind of reunite a little bit, like after forever of their relationship being kind of turbulent. It's kind of sweet. They drive north to a cliffside. Harrison isn't quite sure where they are, but it doesn't matter. Together, they exit Lonan's parked car and hike a trail sharded with yellowed switchgrass. It'll rain soon. They've definitely gone in the wrong direction if their goal was to pick up rhubarb for Suze. The next supermarket won't be in sight for miles, and by then, lightning will have begun to flog the sky. Up ahead, the earth stops, and a sharp drop down 20 feet overlooks a silverish embankment. On the opposite side of the beach, patrons fish with neon poles and silicone bait, but where Harrison and Lonan are, flattening frozen vegetation with their boots, no other person can be seen. Harrison reaches the cliff's edge. Next to him, a bent metal sign reads, "Do not pass beyond this point." He laughs and looks down at the honey locust shrubs dotting the frozen earth below. Where would he go? Carefully, he takes a seat on the ground and swings his legs over the edge. Suzanna might have done something exactly like this when she was his age, splitting a blunt with an old boyfriend, bubbly off life in the scent of pine. Now she'd shoo her son off, say something like, "If you want to kill yourself, there are so many easier ways," and they'd laugh together, because sometimes her sarcasm is all he needs to hear. He grips a few cold chips of gravel. He could collect a handful, set them in a mason jar, and gift them as a souvenir of this trip to Suzanna. Instead, he picks one up and throws it over the edge. He doesn't even know where it goes. Even though he follows its descent into the dead branches of a cedar, at some point, the stone just disappears. He throws another, and the same thing happens. Following its path so attentively, so carefully, and still losing it. I thought about something you said. The sound of Lonan's voice spooks Harrison enough to toss another stone. He turns his chin slightly over his shoulder, not enough to even look at him. These are the first words he's spoken since the haircut, his voice barely above a whisper. "Oh," Harrison says, tosses another stone. He's certain he can follow this one, aims for a plain of driftwood near the shoreline. Still, he loses the path. He feels the breeze shift as Lonan sits next to him. A shuffle of rocks, and a second later, Lonan tosses one down too. "You asked me if I ever wondered what our lives would have looked like if everything had stayed the same." Harrison stiffens. He'd said no, of course. Harrison thinks of that word as he tosses another rock. No. The air has started to smell metallic. Any minute now it could start to pour. Yeah, Harrison says. He doesn't really want to hear more. Maybe he does. This would be the perfect moment for Lonan to reach toward him, his hands firm and not tentative, brave, not scared, and confess his love. So cute. A man who looks just like him in a European rom-com might do exactly this under twinkling Parisian lights. But in all truths, Harrison doesn't know if Lonan has love to confess to him, if he himself could do the same. The waves below simmer against the sand. Harrison clutches a handful of rocks so they indent his skin, then throws them right in. Perhaps Suzanna was right about Lonan's motives to come back to the East. Perhaps he really was only looking for his sister, and perhaps she was also wrong. That his return was not about an either-or, but about a yearning for both. Breeze, strangely warm, laces Harrison's jaw. Above, a single drop of rain hits his crown. When he reaches into the ground, picks up another clump of stones and cranes his wrist back to throw, Lonan touches him. So light that he barely feels it. At first he stares at their hands skin to skin and is distracted by how one's veins seems to momentarily leap into the other's. Then he looks up. In that moment, the air open, the birds fleeing south, the trees swimming along the clouds. Nothing matters but Lonan. Oh, Harrison watches his guarded but gentler face, how he inhales like he's on the brink of confession. If their lives had stayed the same as they were a year ago, if they hadn't strayed onto uncharted paths like a gazelle losing its flock, if they'd gripped each other so surely that one or both disappeared. Harrison looks into Lonan's eyes, blue as forget-me-nots and replenishing like the waves below. When the wind picks up, circles around their shoulders in a seeming connection, Harrison parts his lips for air and without hesitation says, I know. I love this section because after the drama of Mothwork, it was just so nice to see them have a moment of peace together. And it's funny because you're going to see them later, like in Seventh Virtue, at least you're going to see Harrison later when I talk about Seventh Virtue, but you don't get the same energy anymore because it was such a distinctly Feeding Habits Mothwork thing that I just feel really grateful that I was able to see them actually have this moment where they're just sitting on a cliffside throwing rocks and kind of reading each other's minds. It's beautiful. So we're going to jump into Seventh Virtue. Seventh Virtue is difficult to explain because it's complicated. It is adult contemporary fantasy. It is basically like the contemporary fantasy version of Feeding Habits. So essentially what happens is Harrison is inducted into this really magical world when he finds out his ex-boyfriend Lonan has been kidnapped by his magical family, and Lonan's sister Reeve is asking Harrison to help find him, essentially. They need to track down a mystical bird called the Seventh Virtue, which is the head of their family, because in this world there are 7 magical families that coincide with the 7 holy virtues and the 7 deadly sins. So that is Seventh Virtue. They're basically trying to find Lonan. Harrison is hilarious, and you get to see his humor a lot more in Seventh Virtue because he really thrives in genre fiction, I think. So this is him when he wakes up early and he's getting ready, like, to go to breakfast. Harrison exits the room with a slight god complex for waking up before Foster, and also the acute sense that this newfound drama with Reeve has only just begun. He's grateful he inherited his mother's confrontational stubbornness, though, because the first thing he does once he scales the stairs from their suite down to the estate's main foyer is look for Darren. He doesn't give a shit about the marble statues of gods and tigers adorning the walls, the staircases. Yes, there are plural. The moment he sees someone, a young man setting out a cart of flower arrangements along pillars spanning the room's perimeter, he asks where he can find him. Harrison's trying to confront Darren because he's convinced that Darren did something to Reeve, when in reality, Reeve is his best friend. I'm so sorry if you're new to the channel. Like, who are these people? Darren is Reeve's ex, and Reeve is Harrison's best friend, and Reeve is also Lonan's half-sister. Harrison doesn't know Darren, which is funny because they used to be very good friends back in the old books before I, put them into this new world and made them meet each other all over again. So this next bit is Harrison confronting Darren and trying to be like macho or something. I don't know. Darren stands at a kitchen island so large it nearly spans the entire room, whisking. Harrison hopes he's not the type to hand whip cream. Harrison clears his throat to grasp his attention, which does the trick as Darren nearly drops the whisk. Hi, he says, stumbling to regain his rhythm. Sunlight dapples his cheeks from a bare bay window. Now, Darren could certainly be intimidating. After all, he's all GQ and Harrison's all lumberjack. This is actually in the narrative. The fact that Darren still looks posh and not nerdy in thick-rimmed glasses makes Harrison want to hate him even more. Darren clears his throat. Looks like you're doing better. Sorry about my sister. She's protective? Harrison steps closer. Right. Darren puts the bowl down for a second, and Harrison gets close enough to tell that it is whipped cream. God. Isn't that a little pretentious? Harrison asks. Being protective? Hand-whipping cream. Darren's face falls for a moment, but then he smiles. Were you looking to sous chef? Do you want to help cut mushrooms? Harrison slowly pulls out one of the island's bar stools, settles himself. He clasps his hands in front of him, pretending the cold jolt of the countertop's white marble doesn't shock him. I don't want to cut anything, actually. Darren turns to a cutting board where a pile of aforementioned mushrooms sprawl. He snags a chef's knife from the block in front of him and begins slicing them through the middle. You're here to talk about Reeve, he says to the cutting board. Harrison traces a gray wisp of marble with his index finger. Did she ever tell you about me? Sure she did, your best friend. She loves you. No, Harrison says, reaching across the counter to shift a board of half-chopped bell peppers his way. Pass me a knife. I thought you didn't want to cut. Pass me a knife. Darren does. Immediately, Harrison gets to slicing the bell peppers slowly, as if tracing a wrist's vein. I meant if she really told you about me. Darren wipes his hands on the hand towel he slung off his shoulder. What should I know about you? Harrison stabs his knife straight through the board. Bell peppers suspend in the air like dust. Darren glances at it, the splintered wood, the vertical knife. That was acacia wood, a 100-year-old tree. Harrison's like, I don't give a shit about your kitchenware. This next bit is like after Reeve doesn't attend breakfast. It causes drama with Darren's family. We're like, what? Harrison gets upset because like he's like, why are you getting upset at my best friend? And then they all both of them, Harrison and Reeve, end up in the woods together. And Harrison's like, do you want to talk about Darren? Because like I don't know anything about him. Like, can we get some info? Can we get some backstory? This is her reaction. Harrison keeps moving. The lighter doesn't illuminate much, but around him, he more easily notices which parts of the ground are gravelly, which are soft earth. Behind him, he calls, tell me more about Darren. Silence. He turns, holding the flashlight in the vicinity he's imagined Reeve to be, and of course she's there, her face flushing gold in the flame before she turns away. Did I say something? I don't want to talk about Darren, Reeve says. I didn't ask for his social security number, but if you have a list of his known allergies or current enemies, that could be helpful. Don't pick on him, Reeve says. She sounds far away, despite only being a few steps behind Harrison. He's a good guy. It's okay, Harrison will figure it out. They got the Darrison, yeah. The next bit is Harrison remembering the first time he and Reeve met, which is fun because this is a spin-off, so it's not necessarily canon. So I was able to kind of stray from like the original, quite literally, and that was fun to make them meet each other all over again when they're adults. Lonan kept a spare key in the mouth of the ceramic bullfrog just outside the front door. Inside, Harrison kicked off his shoes and set the snacks onto the steps that led up to the apartment. Quickly, he scooped up his goodies and navigated his way to Lonan's bedroom that overlooked the Hudson River. He rolled onto his side of Lonan's mattress, then clicked the TV on. Then he'd spent most of his spare time catching up on reruns of Criminal Minds and America's Next Top Model. He fell asleep somewhere between the two, mildly drunk, smart food wedged in his teeth, and was woken a half hour later by a knife's edge to his throat. Blinking rapidly awake, he was aware a girl stood in front of him and that she was saying something. Also, a knife was wedged against his throat, so he didn't really care what she was saying. But rather focused on the weapon that could very quickly put an end to him, and how ironic would that be? To go out with unbrushed teeth and Tyra Banks shouting in his ear. Sure, that death might have been more desirable than it should have been to him. Would you wait to kill me until after the episode? Harrison asked. It's so funny. Speaking of Darrison, let's jump into some excerpts where Harrison and Darren actually get to know each other a little bit. So the context on this excerpt is that Harrison and Reeve were like attacked and Darren saved them, which is fun. And the acacia wood cutting board comes back up, which is why I'm sharing this. How'd you get us out of there? Harrison asks. This time he keeps his eyes open long enough to notice Darren perk up. You? Harrison laughs. This is ironic. Why? Darren asks. He smooths his hands on his jeans. I stabbed your rare acacia wood cutting board and did nothing to help you repair it, and here you are, repairing me. Darren seems flustered or maybe just embarrassed by what he said. He nudges his glasses up his nose and gestures for Harrison to move his arms from his chest. You're a guest in my home. I threatened to kill you. Darren touches the bandages as lightly as he can manage, and still Harrison hisses in pain. I respect your commitment to your friends, he says. Get you a man who's supportive of all your endeavors. Darrison. Oh, the next bit is Harrison snooping around Darren's cabin, which is where they kind of end up after this attack. That's quite dramatic. If you couldn't tell from the previous excerpt, Harrison is injured. Reeve is gone long enough for the morning sun to harden, blotches magnifying cobwebs and water stains inside the cabin's walls. Staring at the normalcy of what he can only imagine is Darren's hiding spot, or, God forbid, man cave, is the only thing Harrison can think of to tide his boredom over. But after 2 minutes of trying to read the spines of the other books on Darren's shelf, some no-name philosophy book that Harrison would retitle Can't Touch This, a book of Sylvia Plath poems, a guide to spotting stars, he decides that sleeping might be the best alternative. And what's the worst thing that could happen? Either he'll A, wake refreshed, renewed, a better man, or B, he'll have a nightmare of Lonan so bad he'll wake up screaming, and in either case, Darren will be ready to deal with both outcomes like the Prince Charming he appears to be. This is what Harrison thinks of, a fairy tale, a man with a sword and shield and crown, as he drifts into unconsciousness. At one point, his prince shifts into a man with hair the color of India ink and flame blue eyes. I wonder who he's dreaming of. The next bit is also on Harrison's point of view, and it is after Darren rescues them, and Harrison ends up going back to the estate to meet up with his best friend, Foster. Foster is a very responsible person, which you will see in this excerpt, which I think is really cute. What's worse than lying useless in Darren's fishing cabin is listening to Foster whine about it. This is why you should never do anything by yourself. You're constantly chased by people who want to kill you, he says, pacing back and forth in their shared room back at the Peterson estate. Harrison lies back first on the bed, staring at the ceiling painted over with portraits of angels and half-naked men and women who are probably holy in some way. Their biblicalness doesn't matter to Harrison more than their conventional hotness. The Petersons have infuriatingly good taste. Next bit is continuing off of that, where Foster is like, where are you going? Because Harrison's all of a sudden like, hey, I'm injured and I haven't seen you in like an entire day and kind of went MIA, but I'm just going to go do something without telling you. Foster's been going on and on about how he's not about to victim blame, but that he wishes Harrison would process his emotions instead of rage running into the middle of a forest he doesn't know well and blah, blah, blah. Harrison's grateful he's got enough powers to be his own MD because he can't listen to Foster anymore. Where are you going? Foster asks, his hair static around his face like Einstein's as Harrison gets off the bed and stretches his neck. That coupled with his bug eyes makes Harrison laugh. Foster's eyes bulge even further, his throat coating red. Are you laughing at me, Harrison? I spent the last 12 hours readying myself for when I'd need to identify your body at some morgue. Though Foster's last remark seemed casual, Harrison knows his best friend better than that. He looks at Foster beyond his eccentric, red expression and sees nothing but fear. In the last 24 hours, Harrison's given Foster a bigger heart attack than in the entirety of their friendship. And though he sometimes forgets, Harrison knows that to Foster, he's the only remaining family he's got left. They've both got that in common now. Without a word, Harrison crosses the white carpet where Foster stands, and as Darren did with Reeve, secures his arms strong around Foster. You're trying to kill me now. Foster chokes but doesn't resist the hug. I love you, you know that? Harrison says and rests his chin on the crook of Foster's shoulder. I'm sorry I scared you. Foster flushes, his body heat reverberating into Harrison's. Sometimes, he says, I'm confident you're trying to reduce my lifespan, just for funsies. Harrison laughs and pecks Foster on the cheek so he grows even hotter. For funsies? Foster tries to bite back a smile and says, you're embarrassing me. The next section is Foster and Harrison going to a library to kind of figure out a mystery. The first thing Harrison saw when he woke up from his longer nap was not Reeve. By then, she'd taken to sitting outside on the porch, waiting for him to wake up. So instead, he looked at Darren's bookshelf, which gave him an idea. Though Darren offered to teach him to use his magic, he figures the Petersons must have access to helpful books or guides or something instructional. How to use your magic that your ex-boyfriend gave you in an attempt to save your life, even though it's created a target on your back, even though that's also the reason why he gave it to you in the first place, because his family is totally trying to kill you for dummies, if you will. This is also library escapades. Help me pick this lock, Harrison says, jiggling the large golden doorknob that leads into the library. Foster raises both brows. You're going to break in? What if there's an alarm? They probably have secret security in there ready to kick your ass. Listen, I don't care if they're protecting the very first edition of Goodnight Moon in there. We're going in. And also, don't you love reading? How cool would it be if it were just the two of us? Me, you, and 1,000 books to fawn over. Foster seems to consider this, but still refuses to help. Fine, Harrison says, and unbends the bobby pin he found on the hallway floor outside of one of Darren's sister's rooms. Thank God for them. If not, he'd be midway breaking a window by now, which he does later. The lock shouldn't be very easy to pick. After all, a library is a place where rare books and artifacts have to be protected. But with just a few seconds of jimmying, Harrison hears the lock give a satisfying click, and is pushed through the main entrance in no time, aka Rachel really didn't want to write this accurately. Harrison Matthew Frost, Foster calls behind him, his voice lowered to a shout whisper. What the hell are you doing? August Foster Creed, I told you already, Harrison says, and gestures for him to shut the door. He doesn't want to turn on a light, and it's already so dark outside that in the library, he can hardly see his own feet. He shuffles to what he thinks might be the front desk, then pads along the surface until he comes away with something solid, something metal. With a click, the flashlight's on, illuminating a moon-like circle onto the ceiling. Bingo. This is not a bingo moment, Foster says, but follows Harrison through the library anyway. Top 10 Foster dialogue. This is Foster and Harrison being really cute. So Harrison's like taking care of Foster. It's really cute. We love to see their friendship because for a long time, Foster wasn't in the books. And so I'm happy that he's back. Before Harrison settles back down into his lounge, he shoulders off his jacket and as gingerly as possible lays it over Foster's upper body. Foster's one of those strange people who sleeps with a duvet in 100-degree weather, and Harrison's one of those strange people who refuses to sleep with a blanket, even in the middle of a New York winter. He thinks of his city as he finally clicks off his flashlight and shuts his eyes. The way snow, crisp white, turns into a gray gruel of slush. The way that transformation is kind of pretty. The way city lights flicker off the backs of waxed taxis. The way a couple in Brooklyn Bridge Park lean into each other on a silver bench and lattice their fingers together. The gray gruel of snow thing I think I stole from Feeding Habits. We love a queen who is sustainable and reuses, reduces, and recycles her own writing. This bit I'm just sharing because of the dialogue, because Harrison is hilarious. Darren and Reeve are sitting on the floor when Foster and Harrison get back to their room. They're so focused on the spread in front of them, dozens of hand-drawn maps, that they don't notice anyone's entered the room until Harrison clears his throat. Darren jolts so suddenly that the map he's holding goes airborne. Hi, he says, scrambling to snatch it back, and in the process, nearly knocking his glasses off his face. Sorry, I didn't even hear you come in. We're like cats, Harrison says, crossing his arms. Meow. This next bit is Harrison also being very relatable. He's like the best narrator. So the squad is going to go try to meet a virtue. So they are on the Peterson estate, and the Petersons are also one of these 7 magical families. And so that means they also have a bird, and they're going to try to go meet it. Meeting a virtue isn't as simple as Darren's made it out to be. Though Harrison figured Cheritos, the name of the third Reeve's virtue, would just be chilling on the arm of a falconer, in reality, getting to the bird requires getting through what Harrison could best describe as a labyrinth. It's just after dawn. Dew freckles the deep green plains of the Petersons' well-maintained lawn, and thin spreads of sun spins between fir trees. Like he and Foster did yesterday, they've crossed the quad and have been scouting an unpaved path near the southmost edge of the estate. Of course, Darren leads. Not only is he well-read, dashingly good-looking, charming, but in a playful golden retriever way, he's also the kind of man who's energized by the mere sight of 6 a.m. Harrison is not one of these men. Instead, he lags behind Reeve on his third cup of coffee, wishing Foster were here so he could at least bully him instead of himself for being the kind of man who's now made drinking coffee his entire personality. This is one of Harrison's nightmares. So he has been frequently getting nightmares since the beginning of time, basically, of Lonan trying to communicate with him, and it's basically why the entire book starts, because he's like, why am I getting these night terrors? Like, this is terrible. I can't deal with this. Not unusually, while Reeve is still missing and Foster packs astrobulbs into thick soil and the night is velvet and navy, Harrison dreams of fire. Dreams of it clogging his lungs with smoke, flames turning his bones to ash. Tonight, he doesn't scream. He won't. In front of him, a circle of fire. Circles can be so many things: a letter, an emphasis, a wedding ring, a bullseye. In the center of it, Harrison stands. Even when his body disappears into dust, he reappears, an image loading over and over again. For a while, it's only him, his own private hell, and he doesn't even mind it. But then a figure appears in the distance, approaching in what feels like slow motion. Harrison watches him pace forward, each step deliberate. He should warn him. If he enters the ring, he too will turn to ash, then to bone, then to ash, then to bone. Except he doesn't. The figure enters the wall of fire as if it's nothing. He stands in the flames. He doesn't move. He doesn't burn. He doesn't flinch. A gust of wind and Harrison goes tumbling backward toward the wall of flame opposite the figure. He's ash, he's bone, he's ash, he's bone. He's in the middle of fire now, and it's not just a solid circle, but one that remakes itself over and over again, like 2 ends of a chain connecting infinitely. The circle reforms and reforms and reforms, running over itself, an infinity fountain. The figure collapses. He looks so small. He'll die there in the flames, screaming like a wolf, a bird, a man. Lonan, Poor boy. The next bit is in Reeve's point of view, and it is Reeve recalling the first time she met her brother because they didn't grow up with each other. She grew up with her mother and he grew up with his father. They both share a mom. Reeve and Lonan first met in a dingy motel room. She was 10, he was 12. Back then, her mother refused to let her cut her hair short like she wanted, so long tresses strung down Reeve's back like a sallow vine. She'd taken to weaving it into a single braid, but hadn't had time before her mother shuffled her out of the door of their home, a pearl white estate an hour north of Manhattan, and into the back of her champagne Buick. Lonan stood near the motel room's backmost bed, apparently guarding his suitcase. He'd caught lice on a school trip a month before, and as a result, his father, who'd pulled up to the motel 5 minutes before, nudging his son out of the back seat and driving away, had buzzed it clean off. Reeve's first impression of him was that he was as vulnerable as a rabbit circled by a murder of crows. His fists clasped in front of him, his lips pressed tight into a quivering line, his shoulders knobby, bunched up at his ears. She didn't introduce herself. Why should she? Their mother, Izzy, had left them in the motel room as quickly as she assumed the half-siblings, who knew vaguely of each other's existence, would come to acquaint with one another. Reeve turned to her duffel bag that her father had stuffed with her favorites, a lilac stuffed bunny she'd slept with every night, so worn its nose had fallen off, 2 bags of Jack Link's beef jerky, clothes, 10 $1 bills, and the best gift yet, a tub of vanilla frosting with a spoon and a note taped to the cap. "Go slow, rabbit," read her father's careful printing. "Love, Dad." The frosting thing is actually Darrison and Reeve's thing in the original books that I wrote in 2015, but I put it here. Reeve didn't often see her father. He worked overseas in France. She had no idea what he did for a living, just that it required him to wear a fancy pressed suit and to gel his hair back into a hard crystal cast. Reeve dragged the duffel bag from where she stood at the door's entrance and all the way to a vanity/TV stand. She tugged open one of the drawers and began loading her things inside. She knew Lonan watched her. She could feel his stare eroding her back as she knelt to throw her clothes in after her snacks, frantic to hide them. In truth, she did not care about this boy as she knew she should have. Some of the other girls at school had brothers, and sure, they mostly didn't like them, accused them of shooting them with toy guns, of holding candles close to their hair and threatening, as a joke of course, to burn it. Still, they were the same girls to clap loudest at their brother's Christmas pageant show, the same girls who hugged their brothers tight on holidays. Just going to take a second to say I wrote that basically about my brothers. They did all of those things, including the toy guns and holding candles to my hair and literally burned my hair. Thank you very much. But I wrote this when I was at school and I missed my brothers. So that was about my brothers pretty much. The difference between Reeve and those girls is that she knew brothers were overrated. Sisters were the true gems. Her older sister, Anna, was only a few months younger than Lonan. She was also the bravest person Reeve knew. At recess, Anna would scale cedarwood trees in the yard and ignore the teacher's reprimands for her to come down right away. She'd seen her sister be pried off a tree's limb by a janitor more than once. Anna also knew what it meant to be liked. She'd tuck butterfly temporary tattoos into her school books and share them out with the other girls in her class. She'd call the shots at hopscotch, but let everyone, even the quietest kids, join her. Reeve was not brave like her sister, nor was she liked, but that didn't matter. Anna was brave. Anna was liked. Therefore, Reeve could be whatever she wanted. Reeve shoved the vanities drawer back into place, possibly a touch too harshly. Her mother had dragged her here as an attempt to build family values, and now she was stuck in a room with a boy whose face resembled a pigeon's. "You look like a pigeon," she said, her voice strong. On bustling Manhattan streets, she'd sometimes chase after pigeons. She was confident that her analysis of Lonan's likeness was correct. He didn't say anything, still standing in front of his luggage like a confused fawn. "I like cartoons," she said as she bounced onto the bed she'd be sharing with her mother. It was fitted with those stiff, borderline itchy motel duvets. She didn't care. The room had a bubble screen TV. She snatched the remote off the night table and began flicking through channels. "So if you don't like cartoons, sorry." He also did not respond to that. What kind of a person was this guy anyway? All the boys at her school were beyond talkative. In fact, her teacher would often turn the classroom lights on and off as a signal for them to shut up. The motel's cartoon selection was limited. She'd searched for something as basic as SpongeBob, and then for something as excellent as Totally Spies, but the TV only seemed programmed with news channels or French TV shows. She tried watching one for a minute, but her French was limited. Her father had taught her to count to 7 when she was in kindergarten, but not much else. She blew out a frustrated sigh. "Can't you look up a program?" Reeve turned around. Lonan must have spoken to her. Who else would it be? But his voice was so unlike what she'd assumed it would sound like. A bit gravelly, a bit of a whisper. Do you not have a TV at home? I can't just ask it to do whatever I want, she said. Immediately, she recognized she'd said something wrong. His expression didn't falter that much, but it was enough. The soft droop of his brows, a tooth gnawing on his lip. You don't have a TV? He didn't answer and turned back to his luggage. We have 2 TVs at my house, one in the living room, one in my parents' room. Reeve understood bragging about things you had was not particularly ladylike or kind, but she didn't care. Truly, she resented this boy. Who was he? A distraction for her mother in the event she managed to think of him every 6 months? A reminder that she'd once led a life with a man who wasn't her dad? She added, my dad's even gonna buy us a home computer. No reaction. I don't like you, she said and rolled her eyes. What kind of a kid doesn't have a TV? My father has one, he said, voice harder than before. He keeps it in his room, too. And you can't just go in and watch it? Lonan shook his head. Oh. Reeve hadn't considered that before. But what kind of parent wouldn't let their kid watch cartoons? So what do you do for fun? He looked up. Their eyes met briefly, and then he looked back down. Read. She eyed his bags. Is that what you have in there? That you're protecting? Books? He shook his head again. Then what do you have in there, she said, and got off the bed. Her mother had said she was sometimes too curious, that one day that curiosity would come back to harm her. When she reached a hand out to grab Lonan's bag, he stepped in front of her. What? Reeve said. Are you hiding gold? A leprechaun? She pushed toward the bags again, but still he stepped in front of her. This is private, he said. Let me see it. On her next swipe, she managed to catch the bag's handle, and despite Lonan's minor protest, she pulled it toward her and rested it on the ground. Quickly, she unzipped it, eyes eager to see what was so important to this boy, to her brother. She flipped the suitcase open. Her expectant eyes faded. The suitcase was empty. No books, no gold, no leprechaun. She felt around the surface. Sure, he had to have something in there, that maybe it had stuck in the lining, but there was nothing. When she got off the floor, her face was hot, and Lonan seemingly was too, his cheeks coral with embarrassment. He looked like he wanted a black hole to barrel into the room and take him far, far away. It was that and that alone, his feeling of ineptness in front of her, that clicked her next decision in place. Without so much as a thought, Reeve marched over to her drawer. She could pass off a boxy t-shirt of hers, a hand-me-down from a neighbor, off to him. She collected one, a pale blue, into her arms, the second bag of beef jerky, and 5 of the ones. Then she dumped them into his suitcase. She returned to the tub of frosting and held it up to him. I can't split this with you, she said. He didn't even blink. But not because I don't want to. She gripped both sides of the jars and made a motion as if to break it in 2. See? She waited for him to look right at her. She noticed his eyes now, a clear blue, as if the ocean itself was stored there, but it's ours. She zipped his suitcase up for him. She hadn't known it, the feeling that burned deep in her chest back then. It would take years for her to realize that then she'd made a vow to this boy, to her brother. She would not clap loudest at his Christmas pageant shows or hug him tight on holidays, but she would protect him however she could. She was certain of that. My God, it's so cute. The next bit is Darrison and Reeve being chaotic, and I like this chapter because it's called half-half. Every other sentence alternates. Basically, it's quite poetic. I'm just going to read it and you'll see what I mean, but I took my inner poet and I put it into this mini chapter. They both get in their own way. Darrison with the bobby pin he'd stolen from the nurse. Reeve by kicking in a stained glass window on the roof's dormer. He could use the key card Estelle gave him, but doesn't want any surprises. She could charm someone else like she charmed Daniel from Orange County, but has had enough for one night. Darrison doesn't need to see in the dark. He's been in the library once and navigates it a second time with ease. Tunnels in the library's basement, he reminds himself as he hustles between shelves. Tunnels in the library's basement. Reeve can find them easy enough. She spent a year learning to be invisible out of survival, learned exactly how to move through crowded streets as if she were not there at all. She does the same inside an empty library with grace. Down a hall, then a staircase, turn left, right. Darrison might not be as graceful as Reeve, but he sure is determined. A door labeled exit in cherry red letters burns near the drink cart he and Foster had previously taken their share of. It can't be that easy, can it? It's easy how Reeve drops down another flight of stairs and then another. She is air, a feather falling from a bird's wing. A wing of hallways beyond the exit door. Harrison follows them until he reaches a staircase on the right, yanking off the security guard's boxy uniform as he goes. Go. This is the only thought in Reeve's mind. She needs to move like a spider effortlessly scaling its web. She needs to find Lonan. Lonan. What will Harrison even say to him when he sees him? He races down another flight of stairs and then another until there aren't any more, the thought and his pace quickening, his heart rate. Go, he thinks. Go, go, go. They collide. That's a fun chapter. Next bit is Reeve kind of when she's a teenager and Lonan is in her life at this point and they're kind of like allies, the only allies they have. She couldn't let herself trip into a fosse of adolescent longing. She was crying now, but what did it matter? Rain wet her face just as much, dragged mascara down her cheeks. Eventually, she collapsed in front of an oak tree, the knees of her jeans gumming with mud. Her mother would be furious. She didn't care. She ground her legs further until she could imagine herself sinking deep into the earth, a girl returning to ash as she was always meant to. If she was sobbing, it didn't matter. No one would hear her. Her mother wouldn't come looking for her. She gripped her raw cheek. Reeve? At first, she was certain she'd made the voice up. She had to have jogged nearly 3 miles into the woods. But then it repeated again, her name in a clear, familiar voice. She looked up. In the distance, a figure stood, also soaked in the rain as she was. How old had he been then? 18? He'd been away at his father's for much of that year. His hair was shorter, matted to his face in the wet. Even though he was nearly 20 feet away, his eyes were unmistakable. Lonan. She ran for him then, her legs moving so fast she felt like she was floating. It didn't matter what she felt then anymore. Her brother was here. Her brother had found her. She ran to hug him. She ran to show him what Izzy had done. She ran to him to cry. She ran to him to save her somehow, even when he could hardly save himself in that house. Next bit is going to be a little different. We're going to shift into Reeve and Darren. So this is in Reeve's point of view, and it's when she's talking to Darren about his brother, Matthew, who I can't remember how old Matthew is. He's like 12 or something in this book, 12 or 13 when he went missing. Reeve looks at Darren, his plummy under eyes, his gentle yet strong jaw that rarely clenches even when it should in times like this. What was he planning to do before she barreled back into his life? Start a family? Go to grad school? Start a business? Find his brother, finally? Matthew, she says hoarsely, and at first, it's like he doesn't even recognize what she's said at all. Perhaps too surprised to understand the weight of the name she throws at him. Tell me about Matthew. Darren sets the bowl of soup on the floor right in front of her, his face a blank, churning canvas. He swallows, blinks. Please, she whispers. When they were together, Darren didn't often talk about Matthew. Once, though, on a night where his own nightmares kept him up and hers did the same, they met on her apartment's fire escape. It was cramped for them both, but this wasn't an issue. She wound her legs around his, and he leaned onto her shoulder. She understood Darren's grief, and then it mostly presented itself as ambition. He'd explained Matthew's disappearance to her. It was the entire reason they'd met. She prayed for his brother. But it wasn't often that Darren truly allowed himself to steep in his deep, unending loss. That night was an exception. Almost immediately, his face turned toward the stars. He cried. His tears melted into Reeve's hair. Before, on a night similar to this, he told her about how he and his brother often packed up for weekend trips and headed out to the remote woods armed with a tent and a telescope where they'd stargaze. Neither knew much about constellations, but that didn't matter. Their thing was to find any shape they could in the stars, as you would when cloud watching. So Reeve squinted up at the sky too, desperate for the city lights to clear enough for more stars to appear. Of course they hardly did, but that didn't stop her from holding her hand, and naturally, Darren's too, up to the black night. Castle, she whispered to a vague clump of light. She pet his hair, twirled a curl around her finger, around, around, around. Horseshoe, lightning bolt. Soon, she was crying too. She wasn't sure why. Perhaps she was grieving too, but for someone different. Arrow, tulip, herself maybe. The woman she was before her nightmares. The woman she could bear to look at in mirrors. On the hospital ground, Darren adjusted his position on the floor and rested his head against the wall she also leaned against. What would you like to know? He whispers back. What was his favorite color? He closes his eyes. Red. Lonan's is blue. Favorite season? Summer. Lonan's is winter. She asks about Matthew's favorite holiday, Halloween. Lonan's is Christmas. Favorite drink? Hot chocolate. Hot chocolate. It's so cute. To continue on the everybody crying because things are difficult right now, here's Harrison crying and Reeve trying to make him feel better. She awakes to Harrison's face. Jumping, she grips the ground to steady herself, shaking the sound of a child's laugh from her mind. Next to her, Darren still sleeps. Carefully, Reeve rises. They don't go far, just a more private alcove near the infirmary's west exit. Reeve exhales, eyeing Harrison, that there's something different about him, exposed, raw. She realizes what, after a minute longer of analyzing him. He doesn't wear his jacket, the typical soft brown leather she's used to seeing him in. Instead, he's stripped back to just a white t-shirt and looks brand new. Aren't you cold? She asks. This is New York in December, and he's walking around in a t-shirt. He doesn't respond. He looks much younger like this, and even younger when his eyes well up with tears. Oh, she realizes. Oh, his hands coated in blood, his jacket soiled, the t-shirt he now wears seemingly pristine because it really is brand new, a replacement most likely from Darren. Reeve's jaw unhinges. She wants to say something, but all the words she does know catch in her throat and just sit there. Instead, as Harrison shakes, his bare arms clammy with worried sweat, she reaches and sets her hands on his shoulders, holds him up as he all but collapses on her. Oh, Harrison. Harrison who signed up for none of this. Harrison who's done his best at being a good sport about all of this. His mother's disappearance he might still blame on Reeve. His yanking back into a family he tried his best to get away from. His commitment to helping Reeve find humilitas, find Lonan. The next bit I read in a vlog, but I wanted to read it again. It's Harrison after he goes and helps Darren because Darren's drunk. As Harrison spritzes his last round of disinfectants everywhere, the world outside the cabin stills. Somewhere between wiping up the last of Darren's vomit, it's begun to snow. Usually, Harrison might be more aware that he is currently jackettless and will freeze his ass off on the way back to the estate. But right now, the sight makes him breathless. In the early sun, snowflakes star the landscape, settle on silver birches. For a moment, the scent of gunpowder rings his nose, not scary, but welcomed. And he's 12, his hand around his mother's revolver, and she's telling him to get ready to eat dust because he's about to beat her at shooting tangerines 3-3. And there's one tangerine left, and he pulls the trigger, and a bullet rips straight through its citrus belly, and he's laughing and she's laughing, and they're both cold enough for the canteen of hot chocolate she brought along to feel like their insides are ablaze, and their inhales cut like a stinging nettle on the back of a hand. But they are together and beaming. This next bit is me making Darrison more of a thing than it actually is. I'm sorry, I was doing it for myself. Okay. So basically there's a funeral. I'm going to redact who the funeral is for, but there's a funeral and Darren and Harrison are going to attend the funeral. In the evening, an intimate funeral for X is held. Before the afternoon edged into evening, Beverly appeared on the cabin's veranda and let them know. She'd brought 2 suits and black garment bags and informed them the ceremony would be small, perhaps not to call attention to the dead person on the property while important guests of the Petersons stay under their roof, perhaps to pay respect. Beverly handed Harrison one of the suits, and with a cocked brow and flared nostrils asked, "Do you know how to tie a tie?" Of course he said he did. Of course this was an utter lie. As he changed in the bathroom, he fumbled with the godforsaken strip of fabric for so long that when there was a knock on the door and he answered to see Darren, now also suited up, standing in front of him, he didn't even feel mortified that he'd simply closed the door, turned Harrison toward him, and gingerly righted the tie in place. Harrison watched this in the mirror. Never in his 25 years of life had someone done this for him. Anytime he'd have a fancy occasion to attend, which was almost never, Suzanna forewent to tie altogether. Harrison wasn't sure if his own father even knew how to tie a tie, except that his own father most definitely wouldn't have helped him as Darren helped him, and definitely not as nimbly as Darren either. Darren was so focused, squinting through his glasses, that Harrison didn't even have a moment to really understand that he was here, standing in front of him instead of half drunk on the cot outside, not until he'd successfully tied Harrison's tie and nudged it, carefully, up his throat. They caught each other's eye for a moment. What was that emotion in Darren's eye? Embarrassment? Sheepishness? Gratitude? It dawned on Harrison that it was so strange that just a few weeks ago, he had no idea who Darren even was. Standing in front of him, looking at him, truly looking at him, it was as if they'd known each other for their entire lives, or at least had been friends in a past life. When Darren turned for the door, Harrison spoke. Thank you, he said, because what else was he supposed to say? I've never had someone teach me how to tie a tie. Did your father teach you how to tie a tie, or a mother? Who is your father? I yearn for a father, which seems so Lonan of me, and that's sort of humiliating. I miss my mother. The next bit is in Reeve's point of view. You get some poetic vibes in comparison to Harrison, who's chaotic. In truth, Reeve does not remember the last time she saw her brother. It must have been a fleeting moment, her running late through the front door of his sunlit apartment, glancing toward the living room where he sat on the Chesterfield drinking a cup of sencha. A quick good night before she returned to her room, the room he'd saved for her, knowing she was eager to move out the minute she turned 18, the room she decorated as extravagantly as she decorated her own future apartment. Amethyst walls, a tourmaline-studded night table, an acrylic portrait of the son Harrison had painted in place of a headboard, a gold mirror she'd thrifted, looming nearly as tall as her, in the corner. The next bit is Darren and Reeve in Darren's cabin, and it's a vibe. It's vibey. You'll see a vanilla cake shows up at the end of this. I really badly wanted vanilla cake after making this, that I made a cake on this day that I wrote this. Reeve has basically just woken up from a nightmare, and she just so happens to be with Darren. I'm not doing this on purpose. No. Darren, she asks, even though she doesn't have to. He is real, crouched in front of the cot she crashed on last night, his forearm resting against the frame. I'm here, he says. She sits up, exhaling, pressing her fingers against her eyes until Joel's apartment blots away and Darren's cabin replaces it. Do you have any tea? Reeve asks. The small window in the door reveals that the sun isn't even up yet, the sky velvety dark. Of course, Darren says, rising. Anything else? Do you have crackers? Coming right up, Darren says, turning toward the tiny kitchenette. Reeve touches 2 fingers to her racing heart, swallowing any lumps of active fear. She knows she's safe here. After her visit to the infirmary, she asked Darren if he could take her somewhere she couldn't conceivably see Lonan. If she stayed a minute longer in the infirmary or anywhere on the main Peterson grounds, she knew she'd find her way back to him, and when her anger faded, she understood why both Foster and Darren had told her seeing Lonan was not a good idea. She couldn't remember falling asleep. Just that one moment, she was awake on Darren's cot, and he was spreading a comforter on the floor for himself and reading aloud from his copy of Wuthering Heights. She tightens the blanket he'd given her around her shoulders as if containing her own bones in case they collapse from beneath her skin. Ask me to do a task, she says, inhaling, exhaling, inhaling, exhaling. Darren glances up from the pot of water he's boiling on the stove. What? Any task, like how to tie your shoes or how to make a pot of coffee. He nods, considering this for a moment. Then he gestures toward a small tray of dirty dishes on the floor. How to wash the dishes. She breathes in deeply, nodding. Collect all dirty dishes and place them in the sink. Wet a sponge and apply soap. Scrub the dish, rinse. Repeat if necessary. Set to dry. Good, Darren says, ruffling through a box of tea bags. How to bake a vanilla cake. Her brows cinch, this one taking more concentration. A good thing. Preheat the oven, grease a cake tin, cream butter and sugar together, add eggs and vanilla, mix flour and baking powder in a separate bowl, add dry ingredients in batches, then milk, pour the batter into the prepared tin, and bake until a toothpick comes out clean. They do this a few more times. How to make rice, how to fillet a salmon, how to fix a broken zipper. After 5 more minutes of back and forth, Reeve's heart has settled, and Darren's bringing her a mug of steaming tea and a sleeve of crackers. Careful, Darren says as she goes to grab the mug by its belly. He grips its edge, turns it handle first to her, and she takes it, settling it into a gap in her lap. Then he holds the crackers out to her. For a moment, she just stares at them, slotted perfectly in their plastic packaging, a pink rubber band securing the top. When had Darren last eaten crackers here? The thought of him in this cold cabin alone is as comforting as it is concerning. When Reeve secures a hand around the crackers, Darren touches her. It's a mild movement, something he sometimes did when she cut a slice of banana loaf for herself and he just wanted her to know he was there. A brush of fingers, like a kiss. And this is the last excerpt for this video, which is going to be fun. This excerpt is where I'm writing right now. Harrison, Reeve, the whole squad is at the Winter Solstice Ball, which is going to be drama. There's going to be drama. Oh my God, it's going to go bad. The entire room silences the moment they walk in, including the quartet stringing a version of the Goldberg variations. It's horrid, the eyes that flit up Harrison's throat and then Reeve's. Like, of course he knows they're indisputably the hottest people in the room, but the attention of what must be 6 dozen eyes isn't exactly flattering. Can you tell we're in Harrison's point of view? Or perhaps it is, because right at the front of the room, huddled in front of a scarlet punch bowl, are Darren and Lonan. Lonan is back in this book. Oh, fun, fun. Harrison's cheeks flush. If he thought he himself looked hot in the bathroom mirror, Lonan must be something else. Compared to the extravagant jacket picked out for Harrison, Lonan wears a simple black suit jacket and a matching pair of slacks and shoes. It's not the foundation that matters, but the details. What must be nearly 20 rings across both of his hands, all the bands a ragged gunmetal, some inset with black and slate stones. Draped around his neck are 2 chains with ruby pendants. He looks like a prince, a devilishly handsome prince, not a wounded person. Not the small, frail thing he'd seen in the infirmary so many times, but a true blue-blooded royal. Their eyes meet and something registers in Lonan's face. Perhaps he thinks the same of Harrison's looks in this moment. If it weren't for Reeve, who nudges his elbow right then, Harrison might stand there the entire time staring. Thankfully, it's at this time that one of the celloists awkwardly clears her throat, then adjusts her bow in her hand. She glances at Harrison and Reeve at the door, and then at her fellow musicians, then continues the song, and like that, order is restored. Pompously dressed couples turn into each other to waltz, the singles turning back to their flaming paper cups of spanakopita and quiche. The wealthy show of celebration for a holiday Harrison doesn't even understand is enough to take the edge off his embarrassment. Most people are most concerned with staring at the effervescence of the scene. He looks for someone absolutely normal in the crowd like Foster, who is dressed in a forest green blazer flecked with gold leaves, but doesn't find him. He's probably out somewhere with Elias. The only thing left to look at is his own hands, his nails the same glossy red as Reeve's, his final touch. A hand at his wrist. Harrison looks up into Reeve's face, sharpened by a smudged cat's eye and red lip, and is overcome by a sense of relief he didn't know he craved. There's still time to run, she says, and nudges his arm. He looks up at the crowds of people, the gold curtains adorning the walls, the rich purple streamers, the servers dancing around, holding crystal flutes of champagne. And then his eyes trail back to Lonan. There's nothing to do tonight but enjoy this time. To dance with the prince. Harrison clears his throat. Indeed there is. That was my year in writing, pretty much. Of course, I didn't share, the poems or the one short story I wrote because those things I want to get published and I can't excerpt them for that reason. But I had so much fun writing this year, guys. I'm sure there's going to be more that I enjoy. If you like chill reading videos like this, let me know. I'm kind of losing my voice. I've been reading for over an hour now, so I'm going to log off. Let me know what your favorite excerpt was in the comments. And if you have an excerpt of your own that you loved from this year and you'd like to share it, please leave it in the comments as well. I'd love to read your work, or if you've published something and you can send me a link, let me know. But we'll chat in the comments. But for now, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in another video. Bye.